They left a canine for dead in the desert, thinking no one would come for him. But the man they crossed wasn't just a handler. He was the ghost of a war they thought they'd already survived. The desert swallowed sound the way the ocean swallows light, slow and merciless. The outpost was nothing more than a patch of chain link and dust, a forgotten checkpoint between nowhere and less than that. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving behind only the angry afterglow of another scorched day. No sirens, no radio calls, just the kind of silence that hums right before it's broken. Ghost sat at the gate, ears twitching with the wind, eyes sharp even in the fading light. His fur was thick with dust, his vest faded from years of hard use. To anyone passing by, he was just a dog on a leash, another tool left behind to guard nothing. But Ghost wasn't a tool. He was a warning. The roar of engines shattered the quiet. 3 blacked-out trucks rumbled up the dirt road, kicking up plumes of red dust that blurred the stars above. No lights, no plates, just speed and weight. The gate rattled on its hinges as they skidded to a stop. Ghost stood his ground. The first door swung open. Men spilled out, boots slamming the earth, weapons low but ready, faces covered, tattoos winding up their throats like snakes looking for a home. Cartel muscle. Not the street kids who threw rocks and ran. Real soldiers. The kind who didn't need orders to know what violence looked like. Ghost bared his teeth but didn't bark. No wasted noise, no empty threats. The first man hesitated. Just for a second. Enough to feel the weight of what he was about to do. Enough for Ghost to lock eyes with him and see the doubt. But orders were orders. The pipe hit hard across Ghost's side, a wet thud that broke the silence in two. Another blow followed, faster, crueler, driving him against the dirt. His body jerked, legs scrambling for purchase, but they didn't give him a chance. A boot to the ribs, a baton to the spine, kicks, fists, metal and bone meeting without mercy. It wasn't a fight, it was a punishment. Ghost didn't yelp at first. He just clenched his jaws and stared, burning hate into every masked face around him. But when the baton cracked across his hind leg, something inside him gave way, and a low, guttural cry tore from his chest. One of them laughed. Another spat on the ground beside him. When it was done, Ghost lay still, blood soaking into the sand beneath him, ribs heaving with shallow, broken breaths. The cartel men stood over him, satisfied in the way cowards are when they think cruelty is strength. One of them bent down, close enough to smell the copper and dust in Ghost's breath. "Send a message," he muttered, as if Ghost hadn't already. They climbed back into their trucks and disappeared into the night, engines fading into a memory the desert would soon bury. But not Ghost. He stayed, broken, bleeding, alive, waiting. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of engines and violence, the man who mattered most to him felt the first pull of a storm that had just been unleashed. The night stretched wide and empty, draping the desert in a darkness so thick it felt like the stars had been smothered. The air turned colder by the hour, sinking through the cracked earth and settling into bones and broken skin. Ghost didn't move, didn't whimper. He just breathed, slow and shallow, anchoring himself to the one thing that hadn't been beaten out of him: will. Coyotes howled somewhere beyond the ridgeline, high and sharp, but none dared come close. Some instinct deeper than fear kept them at bay. They smelled the blood, they smelled the pain, but they also smelled something worse. The kind of thing that didn't bleed out easy. Ghost's mind drifted, not lost to pain, but wrapped in memory. Training fields under a burning sun. Commands barked low and firm. A hand gripping his collar before a sprint. The feel of motion and certainty. two bodies moving like one shadow across broken ground. Ghost didn't remember the words. He didn't need to. He remembered the man, Reyes, a name that used to carry weight on radios and in after-action reports, the kind of handler other men respected without needing to understand why. Reyes didn't train Ghost to obey. He trained him to think, to read the pulse of a room before the first shot cracked the air. They hadn't just survived deployments together, they had moved through them like a blade through water. Silent, sharp, unstoppable. The cartel didn't know that. They saw a dog, a uniform, an easy target. They thought beating him would send fear ahead of them like smoke before fire. They thought breaking the dog would break whatever thread still tied this ground to the law. But Ghost wasn't tied to a badge. He wasn't bound by leash or title. He was bound to something deeper, older, the kind of bond that doesn't end with broken bones. Somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the chokehold of cold and silence, Reyes felt it. A tremor in the gut, a tightening in the chest. He didn't know the details yet, didn't know where or when, but he knew Ghost, knew the pattern of the world when the animal that shared his bloodline and breath was in trouble. And Reyes was not the kind of man who ignored a pull like that, not the kind of man you sent a message to without expecting a message back. The men in the trucks thought they were done, thought they'd sent fear ahead like a knife in the ribs of a sleeping enemy. They didn't know. They hadn't silenced a dog. They'd woken a ghost, and soon the desert would teach them the difference. The fire burned low in the hearth, throwing restless shadows across the wooden floor. The cabin sat buried deep in the pines, miles from the nearest town, a dot on the map no one remembered anymore. Reyes sat in an old chair by the window, a mug cooling in his hand, the world outside painted in hard black lines and frozen breath. He hadn't spoken a word in hours, didn't need to. Some nights didn't ask for noise, it came all at once. Not a sound, not a flash, just a shift, like a thread inside his chest being pulled taut by unseen hands. He sat forward slowly, setting the mug down without looking. His fingers brushed the scar above his right eyebrow, an old habit that surfaced when instincts moved faster than thought. Something was wrong, deep wrong. Not the kind you could explain away with news reports or gut feelings, the kind that lived in the marrow, wired into the spine from years of learning how to read the air before it turned against you. The trees outside didn't move, the wind didn't speak, but Reyes felt it anyway. He stood, his boots heavy against the worn floorboards. His eyes scanned the tree line, tracing paths he'd memorized long ago, the choke points, the dead zones, the blind corners. A lifetime of training whispering through muscle memory. But there was no enemy out there, no movement, no threat he could see, just silence. And in that silence, something was screaming. He moved to the door, hand hovering above the old coat rack. Ghost's leash still hung there, coiled and weathered, the brass nameplate dulled with time. Reyes hadn't touched it in over a year. Ghost had earned his freedom, roaming between the hills, patrolling his kingdom with the quiet dignity of something wild and loyal all at once. They didn't need tethers anymore. They trusted the space between them. But tonight, the space felt wrong, empty, dead. Reyes closed his hand around the leash. It was warm somehow, as if the memory of 1,000 missions still pulsed through the leather. He didn't curse, didn't pray, just stood there for a long moment, breathing deep, tasting the change in the air like smoke on his tongue. He didn't know what had happened, not yet, but he knew enough. The world was trying to tell him something, and it wasn't the kind of message you ignore if you want to keep breathing. Somewhere out there, in the dirt and the dark, Something sacred was bleeding, and Reyes was already moving before his mind caught up with his feet. The truck rattled down the dirt road, tires skimming over frost-hardened ruts, headlights carving a narrow path through the dark. Reyes drove like a man chasing smoke, fast enough to feel the weight of the turns, slow enough to catch every shadow moving against the trees. His hands gripped the wheel tighter than he meant to. His jaw ached from clenching it too long. Every nerve sat too close to the surface, sparking without reason, demanding movement when there was nowhere to run. The cabin appeared like a ghost at the edge of the woods, roofline sagging under the weight of old snow. No lights, no noise, just that heavy silence again, stretched thin and vibrating with something that wasn't fear, but wasn't far from it either. Reyes killed the engine, stepped out into the cold, and stood there for a second, just breathing. The wind shifted, the trees whispered, but nothing moved. Inside, everything looked the same. Same cracked stove, same leaning shelves, same scuffed boots by the door where he'd kicked them off a week ago after a long patrol through the hills. It should have felt normal. It didn't. His eyes caught on it immediately, the old collar, hanging by the door, half lost behind a rack of worn jackets, thick brown leather, the stitching frayed at the edges, the brass buckle tarnished from years of dust and rain. The nameplate was still there. Ghost, etched deep enough to outlast everything but fire. Reyes hadn't noticed it in months. It had become background noise, part of the place, like the creak of the porch boards or the way the second cabinet door never quite closed. But tonight, it was loud, blinding, heavy enough to pull the breath from his chest. He stepped closer, boots dragging a little in the old rug, reached out, let his fingers brush the collar like a man checking for a pulse he already knew was gone. It was cold, wrong. Something inside him twisted, sharp and deep, cutting past every layer of calm he'd built since the last time the world demanded blood from him. He could see it now, the way Ghost would sit by that door, waiting, not because he was trained to, because he chose to, because he understood the kind of bond you can't teach or force, the kind you earn, inch by bloody inch. Reyes pulled the collar from the hook, curling it in his fist until the brass plate pressed into his palm, hard enough to leave a mark. He didn't need confirmation, didn't need reports or radio chatter. The collar was his alarm, his summons, his war drum. Something had happened. Something was still happening, and the men who started it had no idea that by touching Ghost, they hadn't just broken a dog. They'd torn open a bond strong enough to level kingdoms. And Reyes, silent, deliberate, burning, was already moving to answer. The night had deepened into something heavier than darkness, thick enough to weigh on the skin. Reyes moved through it like a shadow born from the trees themselves, silent, certain, relentless. He didn't waste time calling out, didn't waste breath on hope. Hope was for men who didn't understand how the world really worked. Out here, you didn't pray, you tracked. The trail wasn't hard to find. It started with a smear of blood across the gravel, dried and dark, clinging stubbornly against the cold. Reyes crouched low, fingertips brushing the stain, feeling the brittle edge of it flake beneath his touch. Fresh, but not new. Hours old at most, still warm enough in the memory of the earth to leave a taste of iron in the air. Tire tracks carved deep into the dirt. Heavy vehicles, wide tread, no skid marks. Whoever came had been deliberate, confident. The prints overlapped like a wolf pack circling something small and stubborn and not nearly afraid enough. Reyes followed them without thinking, without second-guessing. His boots pressed into the frozen soil with the kind of surety that only comes from men who've chased blood before. The road wound through low hills and dying brush, the trees thinning into jagged silhouettes against the bleeding stars. The farther he walked, the quieter the world became. No crickets, no owls, no sound at all except the crunch of gravel under his feet and the distant pull of the wind. That was the second clue. Animals had a way of knowing when something bad had been written into the dirt, and tonight the land was holding its breath. The trail veered off near a ditch, the kind dug by rainstorms and left to scar the earth. Reyes followed the curve with his eyes first, then his body, scanning for signs most men would miss. He didn't miss it. The shape was wrong against the earth. Too still, too sharp at the edges. He quickened his pace without breaking into a run, every step folding the distance between them until there was no space left for denial. Ghost lay half buried in the gravel, blood matted into his fur, his sides rising and falling in shallow, broken rhythm. One ear twitched weakly at Reyes's approach, the only sign of life against the wreckage of what had been done. Reyes knelt, hands hovering before touching. Ghost's body trembled under the lightest pressure, ribs cracked, muscles twitching from shock and pain. But when Reyes met his eyes, those deep, dark, still burning eyes, he saw it. Recognition, not defeat, not surrender. Ghost was still here, still fighting. Reyes exhaled slow, steadying his hands as he slid his arms beneath the battered frame, lifting him with the kind of care reserved for sacred things. Ghost let out a broken whimper but didn't resist. He didn't have to. He knew he was home. The leash still hung from Reyes's belt, but he didn't use it, didn't need to. The bond was enough. And as he carried Ghost back through the broken night, Reyes felt the heat of something old and terrible building low in his chest. This wasn't just blood in the dirt. This was a line crossed. And lines like that always get redrawn, with fire. The cabin smelled of blood and cold iron, the scent thick enough to stain the walls. Reyes moved like a machine stripped down to muscle memory, his hands steady even as his heart hammered against the cage of his ribs. The old table creaked under Ghost's weight. The battered canine stretched out on a bed of threadbare blankets and frayed towels, a rough attempt at a battlefield triage that had saved better men under worse conditions. The cuts were deep, some clean, some ragged. Bruises bloomed across Ghost's side, ugly and swollen, dark against the dust-caked fur. One leg bent at the wrong angle, breathing shallow, pain in every twitch of his muscles. Reyes worked with a surgeon's precision, cleaning, binding, stitching where he could. He didn't flinch at the blood, didn't rush. Ghost needed calm, not panic. The dog didn't whimper, didn't cry. He watched. Through it all, he watched Reyes with the same raw trust he always had. Even now, even broken, it hollowed something out inside Reyes, something deep. The world outside the cabin didn't exist anymore. No road, no mountains, no stars. Just the fading firelight, the crackle of burning wood, and the sound of a bond refusing to break. Reyes finished the last bandage and sat back on his heels, his hands stained red to the wrists. His breathing was slow, measured, like a man trying to hold something dark inside that was clawing to get loose. He looked at Ghost, really looked, and the truth settled into his chest with the finality of a closed door. This wasn't a warning. Warnings leave room for mercy, for retreat, for forgiveness if you're willing to beg. This wasn't that. This was a message carved into bone, a declaration. A war horn sounded in the oldest way men know. Through violence, meant to humiliate, not just destroy. Reyes's hands curled into fists so tight the blood fled his knuckles. He stared into the fire, letting its heat lick against his skin. letting it brand the moment into memory. His mind replayed the scene he hadn't witnessed, but knew all the same. The trucks, the boots, the hands that had dared lay waste to something they didn't understand. They thought they had broken something tonight. They thought wrong. They didn't break Ghost. They woke Reyes. And the men who came in the dark thinking they'd made a statement were about to learn what it meant. When a man like him, trained, tested, sharpened by fire and loss, answered back. No speeches, no warnings, just war. He reached over, resting his hand lightly against Ghost's uninjured shoulder, feeling the slow, stubborn thud of life still beating under the battered ribs. You held the line, he murmured, voice barely more than a breath. Now it was his turn. The vow wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. Some oaths are made in blood, bound by scars and kept with fire. And this one had already been written. The storm outside hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. You could feel it in the way the trees stiffened against the wind, in the way the clouds boiled low over the hills, like a fist tightening around the world. Inside the cabin, the fire hissed and snapped, throwing restless shadows against the walls. Reyes sat at the old wooden table, a battered notebook open in front of him, the collar resting beside it, like a relic from a life he never really left behind. The pen moved slow across the paper, not writing, just tracing old scars, old roots burned into his memory by pain and repetition. The names came unbidden, names he hadn't spoken in years, names he thought he had buried deep enough to forget. They rose now, quiet and cold, the way bones rise when the floodwaters come. Cortez, Mendez, Salinas, Vargas, old debts, old blood. Faces lined with dirt and smoke, voices thick with threats, whispered in backrooms across borders Reyes hadn't crossed in a decade. Men he once fought alongside, men he once chased across broken landscapes where life was cheap and grudges were currency. And somewhere among them, threaded through the ranks like rot in the foundation, was the new hand of the old cartel. The message left on Ghost wasn't random, it wasn't business, it was personal. Reyes leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He let his head tip against the wall, staring up at the cracked ceiling, breathing slow. He could almost hear them again, those old voices promising that time would wipe the slate clean, that if you kept your head down long enough, the sins you survived would eventually forget your name. They lied. The past doesn't forget. It just waits. Waits for the moment when you're tired, when you're still, when you think you've outrun the tide. Then it rises and drags you back under. Reyes rubbed his palms against the thighs of his jeans, grounding himself. He wasn't a young man anymore. The years had built calluses in places no one could see, but underneath, the blade was still sharp, still ready. He looked over at Ghost, sleeping by the hearth, his breathing steadier now but still raw. They didn't just hurt a dog. They called out something older, something Reyes had spent a lifetime trying to put down. And now, one by one, the men who thought they could write history in blood were going to find out. They hadn't buried Reyes. They had just given him a reason to dig back up everything they were trying so hard to forget. And by the time they heard him coming, it would already be too late. The checkpoint sat like a broken tooth in the middle of the desert, a slapdash mix of rusted shipping containers, sagging fences, and floodlights that flickered against the black sky. The cartel ran it like a toll booth, squeezing smugglers and travelers alike, a tax paid in fear or blood, depending on who you were. Most nights, the men posted there were bored, half drunk, half alert. Tonight was no different. A pair of them leaned against the hood of a battered pickup, cigarettes burning low between their fingers, rifles slung lazy over their shoulders. The radio inside the shack crackled some old corrido song, thick with static. Nothing moved but the wind, dragging dust across the concrete in lazy, curling patterns. They didn't see him, not until it was too late. Reyes moved like shadow, low and fast, ghosting through the gaps between light and dark. No sound, no warning, just a ripple at the edge of the world where a man should not have been. He didn't need to get close. He didn't need to pull a weapon. His message didn't require blood. Yet. He reached the main shack, a lopsided trailer bolted to cracked asphalt, and slid a small package through the half-open window. One photograph. Nothing else. No note. No signature. No fingerprints. Then he vanished back into the night, swallowed by the land he knew better than any map. It wasn't until 15 minutes later, when one of the guards staggered inside for a piss break, that the trap sprung. The man found the photo sitting dead center on the desk, pinned under a chipped coffee mug. He frowned, muttered something in Spanish under his breath, and pulled it free. For a moment, the world stayed normal. Then he really looked at it. The dog, bloodied, bruised, alive. Ghost's eyes stared straight into the camera lens, not broken, not beaten, defiant. A scar now running just beneath one ear like a brand, but the fire in him untouched, burning hotter than before. The guard's hand trembled. He knew the story. Everyone did. The order had gone out quiet, passed down through whispers. Rough up the old man's dog. Make it a message. Break something that couldn't fight back. Show the hills that the cartel was God here. But the photo in his hand didn't show defeat. It showed a promise. Someone had survived. Someone who wasn't supposed to. The guard burst out of the shack, shouting for the others, waving the photo like it might catch fire in his fingers. Engines roared awake. Radios snapped to life. Panic bled into the checkpoints like smoke under a locked door, but it didn't matter how fast they moved. The message had already landed. And deep in the desert, under a sky split by lightning no one saw coming, Reyes kept walking. Not running, not hiding, hunting. By dawn, the photo had crossed 3 towns and half the cartel's inner circle, passed from trembling hands to furious ones, held up under dirty neon lights and whispered about in cracked, anxious voices. It didn't matter if it was a copy of a copy. Grainy, bent thumbprints smudged across the corners. The image still burned. Ghost. Alive. Watching. The checkpoint guards had been stripped of their weapons by noon, lined up against the shack and questioned until their knees gave out. No one had seen who dropped the photo. No one had heard a car, a bike, a boot step. It was just there, like a curse left at their feet. Osuna, the local enforcer, paced outside the checkpoint, a toothpick grinding between his teeth so hard it snapped clean in two. His boots crunched over the gravel as he moved, fast and agitated, spitting curses into the dry wind. His radio squawked on his hip, men shouting over each other, trying to piece together how it happened. No answers, just fear, real fear, the kind that makes seasoned killers glance over their shoulders and flinch at nothing. Someone spoke the name first, soft, like maybe the desert wouldn't hear it if they kept their voice low. Reyes. A ghost from wars no one wanted to remember. A man who didn't send warnings, who didn't leave survivors. His story had lived in their circles like a half-forgotten prayer, a nightmare told by older men over cheap whiskey and cigarettes burned too short. Years ago, he had disappeared. Some said he was dead. Some said he was broken. Some said he had buried himself so deep in the hills even the devil forgot where to find him. But now there was a photo. Now there was blood. Now there was a reason to believe the stories were never stories at all. Osuna punched the side of the checkpoint shack hard enough to rattle the window frame. He barked orders into the radio, telling the crews to arm up, double the watch, lock every back road from here to the river, barked them again when no one moved fast enough. It didn't help, because deep down, they knew. You can guard against bullets, you can brace against storms, but you can't outrun a reckoning that walks in silence and strikes from the dark. They didn't just beat a dog, they resurrected something colder, something older, a force that didn't negotiate, didn't forgive, and didn't stop once the blood started spilling. They hadn't sent a message that night in the desert. They'd signed their own death warrants. And the desert was already writing the rest of the story. With dust, with fear, and with the slow, merciless patience of a man who had waited a very long time to even the score. The night came down heavy and thick, pressing against the cabin like a second skin. No stars, no moon. Just darkness so pure it swallowed sound before it could finish breathing. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting only a faint orange glow that didn't reach the corners of the room. Reyes sat in the shadows by the window, a book open on his lap he hadn't read a single word from. His boots were still dusty, his coat still smelled of road dust and old wood smoke. He wasn't relaxed, he wasn't tense. He was still. The kind of stillness that only came from men who didn't wait for threats to arrive. They welcomed them. The air shifted just before the first footstep touched the porch. It was small, almost polite. Like the man approaching still thought stealth mattered. Reyes closed the book softly and set it aside. The second step creaked. The third didn't. Smart. Knew the boards were loose. Knew to avoid them. Not local muscle. Hired. Professional. Reyes stood without a sound, moved through the cabin with the kind of precision that leaves no memory behind. He didn't bother with a weapon. Didn't need one. He reached the door just as the handle turned, just as the night outside sucked a little colder. The door swung open slow, almost careful. The silhouette slipped inside, knife low, pistol tucked against his ribs. Smooth movements. Clean. No hesitation. But he wasn't fast enough. Reyes moved, like a current breaking a dam, silent until it was too late to fight it. He caught the intruder's wrist, twisted it hard enough to snap tendons, sent the knife skittering across the floor. The man grunted, swung with the pistol, wild now, fear creeping in. Reyes ducked the swing, drove a shoulder into the man's chest, slammed him back into the wall hard enough to rattle the old frames. The gun hit the ground. Useless. The fight was over before it started. The man struggled, gasping, one hand clawing for something that wasn't there. Reyes pressed his forearm against the man's throat, not crushing, just holding, just letting the pressure do the talking. "Who sent you?" he asked, voice low, steady. The man didn't answer. Couldn't. Didn't matter. Reyes wasn't looking for names. He was sending a message. He released the man just long enough to shove him hard toward the door. The hired gun staggered out onto the porch, coughing, clutching his throat, slipping in the frost as he tried to stand. On the step beside him, neatly placed where he couldn't miss it, was a single piece of wood, burned black at the edges, carved into the surface with the precision of a blade. Return. That was it. No threat. No explanation. Just a command. The man stumbled into the darkness, dragging fear behind him like a broken limb. And Reyes watched him go, the leash coiled around his hand, the firelight catching the scar along his knuckles. The next move wasn't his. It was theirs, and they had already made their first mistake. The days crawled by, slow and heavy, measured not in hours but in heartbeats and breaths. The cabin stayed quiet, wrapped in a hush that felt sacred somehow, like the walls themselves understood what was being fought for inside. Outside, the first hints of winter clawed at the trees, stripping the branches bare and leaving the hills skeletal against a bruised sky. Ghost lay near the hearth, his body curled into himself, the stitched wounds along his ribs still raw, still angry. bandages wrapped tight around his leg, the once powerful muscles trembling under the strain of simply surviving. Reyes kept the fire burning low and steady, the heat just enough to chase the chill from the floorboards, but not enough to make the dog sweat under his heavy fur. There were bad days. Days when Ghost barely lifted his head, when his breathing stuttered uneven and broken, when the weight of what had been done to him hung too thick to fight against. On those days, Reyes sat nearby, sharpening knives that didn't need sharpening, oiling a rifle he didn't plan to fire yet, never speaking, never rushing, just staying. Because sometimes healing wasn't about doing, it was about being there when nothing else could be. And there were good days, too. Small victories carved out of stubbornness and blood. A twitch of an ear at a sound beyond the door. A slow, deliberate blink when Reyes entered the room, not fear, recognition. A tail thump, soft and weak against the old rug, but there, alive, fighting. One morning, just after the frost had coated the porch in silver, Ghost pushed himself up onto shaky legs. Reyes watched from the kitchen, one hand frozen halfway to a cup of black coffee. Ghost stood there, trembling, ribs quivering under the strain, but standing. Eyes locked onto Reyes with a fierceness that hadn't dulled, hadn't dimmed. He didn't whine. He didn't collapse. He took one step forward, then another, and another. Reyes set the cup down slow, crossing the room without a word. He knelt beside Ghost, one hand steady on the dog's shoulder, feeling the heat, the tremble, the iron underneath the wound. "You're not done," Reyes said quietly. Ghost's ears flicked, a breath huffed from his nose, almost a grunt, almost a laugh if dogs could laugh at all. Not broken, not beaten, just tempered. The fire wasn't gone. It had gone underground, fed by pain and rage and the stubborn loyalty of something that refused to die easy. Reyes knew that feeling too well. He leaned his forehead gently against Ghost's, closing his eyes for a moment, the silence between them louder than any vow spoken out loud. Whatever came next, they would meet it standing, scarred, bruised, unbroken, and burning hotter than before. The first snowfall came like a whisper, soft and slow, covering the world in a thin veil of white that muted every step, every breath. The hills wore it like armor, and Reyes moved through them as if he'd never left, as if the years between blood and silence had only sharpened what was already carved into him. He didn't come at them loud. He didn't come at them angry. He came the way winter does, inevitable, merciless, without a sound. The first to fall was a runner named Luis, caught between a deal and a safe house, moving supplies under the hush of midnight. Reyes didn't break his legs, didn't spill blood across the gravel. He simply left Luis tied to a telephone pole at the crossroads, stripped of his cartel patch, a photo of Ghost stapled to his vest. By morning, every man in the valley knew it. They called emergency meetings, tightened their circles, hired new lookouts. It didn't matter, because Reyes wasn't attacking their bodies. He was attacking their minds. Then it was Marquez, the butcher who thought he was untouchable behind steel doors and wired fences. He woke to find his house stripped clean of every weapon, every ounce of muscle he trusted to keep him breathing. On the kitchen table, Reyes had left a single, blackened dog tag. No note, no threats, just presence. The message stitched itself into their bones. Nowhere was safe. No door was thick enough. No night was dark enough. Reyes mapped the old networks in his head as he moved, memory folding back into instinct. Supply lines, meeting points, escape routes carved into the hills when they were young and reckless. He knew where they would hide because he knew how they thought. Fearfully, selfishly, badly. And every time they shifted, every time they tried to pull tighter into themselves, he was already there, waiting, watching, tearing them down, not with bullets, but with precision cuts that bled trust and loyalty dry. Ghost moved with him when he could, limping but alert, the scar behind his ear like a brand against the falling snow. His nose led them when sight couldn't. His growl warned of things Reyes hadn't yet seen. They didn't need words. They didn't need plans. They were the plan. Each night, Reyes returned to the cabin without fanfare, without trophies. He sharpened his knives, cleaned his gear, sat by the fire while Ghost rested by his side, the weight of the day heavy, but never enough to slow the fire burning underneath. He wasn't fighting a war. He was breaking a machine, gear by gear, bolt by bolt, until all that was left would be fear, and the sound of footsteps closing in, slow and final, like the cold hand of a season no man could outrun. And by the time they realized what was happening, the silent hunt would already be over. The rot started at the edges first, the way it always does. Whispers in the corners, eyes darting faster across rooms, men stepping through doors sideways, scanning the shadows before they dared to breathe. Fear didn't scream through the cartel. It seeped, slow and heavy, filling lungs and minds until every word tasted like suspicion. No one trusted the night anymore. No one trusted each other either. Osuna, the checkpoint boss, doubled the guard rotations, tripled them by week's end. No man stood watch without backup now, but it didn't stop the bleeding. Radios clicked with static. Sentries found their patrol trucks stripped to the frame. A small weapons cache went missing outside San Reyes Creek. No alarms, no footprints, no broken locks. Just gone. Just like that. Every loss was a question mark, and every question mark was a crack. The lieutenants felt it worst. Marin, who had once bragged about never fearing any man, now kept a pistol tucked in the back of his jeans, even at his own dinner table. He slept in different houses every night, moving like a rat through mazes he thought he had built to trap others. Barton, young and stupid, grew louder as the days stretched thin, trying to smother his own dread with threats and flexed bravado. He barked orders over radios that crackled empty, cursed at shadows that didn't move, threw punches at men for looking too long or speaking too soft. And Osri, the one who thought himself a king, watched it all with eyes that no longer carried command, but calculation. He knew. You didn't stop a storm by shouting at it. You didn't unbleed fear once it started leaking. You only controlled it as long as no one else smelled the blood in your own teeth. And right now, the blood was thick in the air. Meetings became accusations. Accusations became fists. Fists became knives under tables. Trust, once held together by the brittle glue of shared profit and silent threats, now crumbled under the slow grind of paranoia. Every man was a potential traitor. Every silence sounded like betrayal. Every breath felt borrowed. The cartel had always relied on fear to keep their power stitched tight. But Reyes was different. He didn't use fear to push them down. He let fear hollow them out from the inside. He didn't need to kill them. They were doing it themselves. One whispered rumor at a time. One cracked glance at a brother at a time. One sleepless night after another. And as they tore at each other's throats, desperate to find the ghost they had summoned, Reyes stayed in the shadows, watching, waiting, knowing that when a structure collapses from within, you don't have to swing the hammer. You just wait for gravity to finish the job. The safe house sat rotting at the edge of an old quarry, a forgotten relic from when the cartel still believed in fortresses built out of steel and concrete. From the outside, it looked dead. Boards over the windows, rust bleeding down the sides of the corrugated metal roof, a single broken antenna stabbing up into the gray sky like a snapped bone. It had been abandoned for years, left to sink into the dust like so many bodies buried nearby. Until tonight. Tonight, Reyes lit it up without lighting a match. He started with the rumors. A whisper passed to the right ears at the right time. Shipments moving through the hills again. Routes that needed securing. A hidden cache left behind when the last crew panicked and ran. No names, no promises, just the suggestion of opportunity, of profit. It didn't take much. The lieutenants were already cracking. Desperate men don't check too hard when hope is dangled in front of them. By midnight, 3 trucks rolled into the quarry, headlights dead, engines grumbling low under the weight of their cargo. Men poured out in small groups, weapons drawn, boots crunching over broken gravel. Barton led the first crew, swagger still intact, but his eyes twitching at every gust of wind. Marin followed with his own men, quieter, tighter, his hand never straying far from the grip of his pistol. They didn't trust each other. That was the point. Inside the safe house, the traps weren't bombs. They weren't bullets. They were questions. Doors left open just wide enough to make you wonder. Footsteps scuffed into the dust in directions that didn't make sense. Small, deliberate signs of movement. Too fresh, too many. Enough to set nerves twitching and paranoia gnawing at already frayed edges. And then, in the center of the main room, under the exposed beams sagging like old ribs, Reyes left the real trigger. A photo. Same as before. Ghost. Alive. Staring. But this time, the photo wasn't clean. A second image was taped behind it, grainy security footage showing one of the lieutenants slipping out of a checkpoint 3 nights before with something under his coat. Smuggling. Betrayal. Maybe true. Maybe not. Didn't matter. Barton saw it first. His face went white, then red. He turned on Marin like a blade snapping free of its sheath, shouting accusations before his brain caught up to his mouth. Marin responded the only way a man drowning in fear does. He drew first. Gunfire ripped through the safe house, shattering the heavy silence. Men ducked for cover, but there was no enemy outside to shoot at. The enemy was inside. Among them. Inside their own lungs, inside their own heads. They tore each other apart in seconds. By the time the dust settled, the safe house was littered with bodies, bullet casings, and the broken echo of a loyalty that had died long before the first shot. Outside, standing in the distant tree line, Reyes watched through a battered scope. No smile, no satisfaction. Just the cold certainty that some wars aren't won by pulling a trigger. They're won by making sure your enemies never realize they were the ones who loaded the gun. The list wasn't long anymore. Reyes sat at the cabin table, the battered notebook open under the flicker of the low fire. 3 names, written in ink that had bled into the page like wounds refusing to clot. 3 men who thought they'd sent a message when they left Ghost bleeding in the dirt. Now the message was coming back. No warnings, no signatures, no mercy, just balance. He closed the notebook with slow, deliberate finality, stood, buckled the old leather vest he hadn't worn in years, the one with no markings, no colors, no allegiances, just scars stitched into the seams. Ghost rose too, slow but steady, standing taller now, stronger. The fire in his eyes burned clean and sharp, a mirror to the man at his side. They moved into the night without ceremony. The first name was Arturo Vega, the organizer, the one who had nodded once at a whispered plan and let the rest unfold. Reyes found him at a backroom poker game on the edge of Red Mesa, drunk on cheap whiskey and borrowed power. He didn't kick the door in. He didn't shout. He just appeared, a shadow peeling itself from the darker parts of the room, crossing the space between life and death in 3 measured steps. Arturo didn't even have time to scream before Reyes dropped him with a single clinical blow. Not dead, but erased. Left sprawled across the table, a photo of Ghost pinned to his chest with the same knife he once used to threaten boys too scared to fight back. The second name was Navarro, the enforcer, the one who had put the first boot to Ghost's ribs, the one who laughed the loudest. Reyes found him at a safe house on the border, drunk and coked up. Guards passed out around him like spent matches. This time, Reyes didn't need stealth. He walked through the door and Navarro saw him coming. Eyes wide, mouth stammering, the gun in his waistband forgotten in the split second between memory and terror. It wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. Navarro went down hard, one arm twisted, face buried in the dirt. When he finally looked up, bleeding and broken, Reyes crouched low, Ghost at his side, silent and staring. No words, no explanations, only judgment. And then there was the last name, Osri, the architect, the one who hadn't lifted a hand but made sure every blow landed exactly where it would hurt most. Reyes knew he wouldn't find him drunk or cowering. Osri was too smart for that. He would be waiting, planning, maybe even thinking he still had a move left on the board. But Reyes wasn't coming with plans anymore. He was coming to end it. The names had been written. The debts had been tallied. And tonight, one way or another, the account was closing. The sky hung low and heavy, smeared with the dull bruises of a coming storm. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the hills, silent for now, but promising a violence that had nothing to do with the weather. Reyes tightened the straps on his pack, checking the weight of each knife, each magazine, each piece of quiet, deliberate purpose he carried. No excess, no noise, only what was necessary. Ghost stood near the doorway, his shadow stretched long across the cabin floor by the dying fire. His ribs were still healing, the scars along his flank catching the firelight like silver threads stitched into muscle. But there was no weakness in him now, no tremble, no hesitation, only resolve. The leash hung from Reyes's belt untouched. It had been for days now. Ghost didn't need it. He never had really. Their bond was older than rope and stronger than steel. Reyes knelt down, meeting the dog's eyes level. For a long moment, neither moved. They just breathed the same breath, shared the same certainty that whatever came next wouldn't be survived by accident. It would be survived by will. "You sure?" Reyes asked, voice low, rough. Ghost's ears flicked forward. His tail twitched once against the floor, slow and steady. His gaze never broke. He was sure. He had been sure the moment the first boot had come down in the dirt and he hadn't run. They moved out together, into the cold, into the dark, into the place where fear still held sway, but only just barely. The wind cut hard across the ridges, tugging at Reyes's jacket, lifting the dust into thin, swirling ghosts of their own. Ghost padded silently beside him, his steps lighter now, cleaner, his limp nearly gone. At the crest of the hill, they paused. Below them, the cartel's last stronghold pulsed against the dark, floodlights cutting jagged slices across the empty yard, guards huddled around burn barrels, rifles slung too loose across tired shoulders. A compound built on fear, now eating itself from the inside out. Reyes crouched, scanning the layout. His fingers brushed lightly against the scar along Ghost's ear, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had already survived to get here. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't revenge. This was the final chapter being written with footsteps and teeth and silent oaths that had waited too long to be fulfilled. Ghost shifted closer, his muscles coiling with a tension that wasn't fear but focus. His mouth opened slightly, tongue curling in a breath that steamed white in the frozen air. Ready, waiting, burning. Reyes smiled then, but it wasn't a smile meant for comfort. It was the kind a wolf gives before the first bite lands. "Let's finish it," he said. And together, without a sound, they moved down the hill toward the reckoning that was already waiting for them. The fall didn't come with the roar of gunfire or the flash of explosions. It didn't scream. It sighed. The compound's outer fences stood tall, wrapped in coils of rusted wire, but inside the walls, the real defenses were already broken. Fear had seeped into the concrete, into the bloodstreams of the men holding rifles too loosely and glancing too often at the dark beyond the lights. Fear doesn't shout when it kills you. It whispers. Reyes slipped past the first guard without a sound, the man too busy looking over his own shoulder to notice death passing 2 feet from him. A quick twist, a choke of breath, a body folded neatly into the shadows. No gunshots, no alarms. Ghost moved ahead of him like a streak of smoke, low and fast. His paws barely touched the ground, his nose cutting through the night with the precision of memory and purpose. They wove through the maze of crates and abandoned vehicles, silent judges moving through a city built on borrowed time. Inside the main building, the walls were cracked and the floors were slick with old oil and colder sweat. Reyes found the map room first, a table still cluttered with plans, names, shipment routes. Useless now. The network was already dying, collapsing in on itself the way dying animals try to bury their heads before the final blow. He didn't torch the papers, he didn't smash the radios, he left them. Proof for when the vultures came. Proof that the men who had built this empire of fear had already given up long before Reyes arrived to light the match. One by one, the dominoes fell. Men turned on each other in the dark, blaming shadows, blaming silence. The power they thought they owned slipped through their fingers like dust. No one rallied. No one stood their ground. They melted away, fled into the hills, into the dark, into the kinds of nights that never forget the sound of your own name breaking in your throat. Reyes didn't chase. He didn't have to. The damage was done. The fear he had seeded grew wild now, strangling loyalty, snapping the thin bones of brotherhood like dry sticks under a hunter's boot. By the time he reached the heart of the compound, there was nothing left worth fighting. Only echoes, only ruins, only the sound of Ghost's low growl rumbling through the open doorways, a sound that didn't call for battle anymore, but for closure. Reyes stood at the center of what was once their pride and power, boots planted firm on the cracked concrete, and breathed deep. No bullets spent, no blood spilled, just precision, just patience, just fear weaponized the way only a man like him could wield it. The cartel didn't fall in fire. It fell in silence, and the silence was louder than any war they had ever imagined. The road home was the same as it had always been, narrow, rutted, half-swallowed by the creeping fingers of the forest. But tonight it felt different. Not lighter, not cleaner, just quieter, like even the trees understood that something had ended out there beyond the hills. Reyes drove slow, the truck's old engine humming low under the weight of memory. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him worth seeing. No fires, no graves, just empty space where men once thought fear was enough to build an empire. Ghost rode beside him in the passenger seat, head low but eyes awake, tracking the turns like he always had. The scars along his ribs pulled tight when he shifted, but he didn't whine. He didn't flinch. His body carried the map of what had been done to him, but it didn't carry defeat. They crested the last hill just as the first pale light of morning bled into the horizon, smearing gold and gray across the tips of the trees. The cabin waited below, small and still, smoke curling lazy from the chimney into a sky too tired to care. Reyes killed the engine and stepped out, boots crunching against the thin layer of frost. He didn't rush. didn't hesitate, just opened the door for Ghost and waited, one hand resting lightly on the frame. Ghost leapt down with a grunt, shook the cold from his fur, and trotted toward the porch with the steady, scarred pride of a soldier returning to ground he never truly surrendered. Reyes followed, the leash still coiled at his hip but untouched. He wouldn't need it anymore. They crossed the porch together. The door creaked the same way it always had. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the smell of old wood smoke and something simpler. Peace, maybe. Or at least something close enough. There were no banners, no medals waiting on the table, no crowds shouting their names into the sunrise, just silence. The kind that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that says, "You survived." The kind you earn. Reyes dropped his gear by the door, peeled off the coat that had carried too many ghosts, and hung it on the rack. The collar still hung there too, Ghost's old leather one, faded but unbroken. A relic of who they were, and proof of who they still chose to be. Ghost circled twice by the hearth, the way he always did, then settled into the blanket there with a low, satisfied sigh. His eyes followed Reyes for a moment, then closed, trust wrapping around him like a second skin. Reyes moved to the chair by the window, the one worn into the shape of his frame. He sat down slow, stretching his legs out, resting one hand lightly on the old hunting knife still strapped to his belt. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, the fire whispered. And between them, man and dog, soldier and survivor. The bond remained, stronger than blood, stronger than time, forged in silence and sealed in something even deeper. Peace wasn't the absence of war. It was what waited when you had nothing left to prove, and someone still at your side to share the silence when it came. And tonight, finally, they had earned it.